2023 college football season isn't even technically over. We still have a national championship to play, FBS, FCS, so on and so forth. But for the Big 12, it's done. For the current iteration and the future iteration of the Big 12, it's over. So it's time to start looking ahead, because it's never too early to do a way too early look ahead to what's to come in what's going to be a 16-team Big 12 conference when the teams take the field this coming fall. I got to remember, it is 24 now. It's not still 23. So to join me today to do a way too early look at Big 12 contenders for the 24 season, he is, if you're a YouTube fan, I assume you listen to his show and watch his show, as I do as often as I can. He is John Kurtz. Welcome back, friend.
Hey, I appreciate you having me on. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. You just seemed like a good time to get you back on the show. Seemed like a worthy conversation to have. Look, as I was preparing for this and had the idea for it, I think it made the most sense, because we always do way too early looks. And I think in the Big 12, usually you know, especially when it's a 10-team conference, we'd have a 2 or 3 teams we talk about. 16-team conference. No Oklahoma, no Texas. So no perennial favorite in Oklahoma. No feels like the right pick and turns out to be Texas like this year. We've talked about the Big 12 for a while now, ever since Oklahoma and Texas announced they were leaving, was going to be this wide open conference. It's fun to bet. It's going to be exciting because you never know who's going to win. We've seen teams get to the Big 12 championship game every year now since it came back that were picked like 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th in the preseason poll. As I put this list together, this is exactly what we all said would happen, because I have 7 teams I think I can put into a contenders list. For those of you listening in podcast land, this is not a visual medium. I'm using air quotes contenders, because who the hell knows? And I've got at least 3 other teams I think are kind of on the, let's call them dark horse, on the outside looking in. How big is your list as we sit here in January having this conversation?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's definitely as advertised. I mean, everybody said this conference is probably going to be lacking at the top. I mean, that's what you're missing with really in Oklahoma. Obviously, this year it was Texas, but more consistently it was Oklahoma, a team to legitimately challenge for a national championship. I don't think that you have that in this league, although, you know, Arizona may be a preseason top 15-ish kind of team. They're probably approaching that sort of rarefied air. But yeah, I mean, I think I would go 7 and then maybe 8. UCF getting KJ Jefferson to me is the one that kind of jumps into the fold potentially there. I still think there may be more of an adjustment period for them coming in, but you know, KJ Jefferson, PJ Harvey, they've got talent at receiver. They've got skill talent. They've got a great recruiting class coming in, borderline top 25 recruiting class coming in this year. So I really like a lot of what Gus Malzahn's doing. And by the way, I think he's a really good coach too. So, you know, when that's kind of the bottom of it, I mean, it proves the depth that this league has. And I think I would go, you know, I mean, Arizona, I think, should be the favorite. Like I said, they've got a stud quarterback coming back, young quarterback who obviously lit it up this year. They've got a 1,400 plus yard wide receiver coming back. Overall, they have 18 of 22 starters returning. I mean, there's just a lot to like there. And they obviously punctuated a 10-win season with a victory over Oklahoma in the bowl game, which to me kind of announced their candidacy there and probably set off what will be a nice little hype train going for them. Utah's Utah. I know it was not their best year, but they're going to get Cam Rising back for, I believe, legitimately a 7th year of college football, which is crazy. But having him paired with Kyle Whittingham, they're going to be a contender. I don't think there's any other way around that.
Sorry to interrupt. I agree on Arizona wholeheartedly. Like, and I don't want to oversell the bowl game. Like, you're not going to force 6 picks in every game of the upcoming season, but like, they bring back most of the whole team, and it really feels like they've figured a lot of things out this year. And so if you look at that and say, okay, well, you're coming from a P5 to a P5. You performed very well in what was a good Pac-12 in its final season, and a lot of those guys are still young and new, and you're going to have guys develop over this offseason, continue to improve. Like, it's hard not to look at Arizona and say, I know they're coming into the conference for the first time, but this is going to be kind of a new thing for everybody. You're still getting used to the 4 newcomers from this year. You're going to have 4 new schools that you're not used to playing next year. The schedules are all completely unbalanced. I'm not shocked that you say Arizona should be the preseason Big 12 favorite. I don't think you're the only person who thinks that way. I'm having a hard time not viewing them as a early preseason number 1 for the Big 12 and 24.
Yeah, you know, I mean, it's not like they came from. This is different than an adjustment period for the 4 teams that came in this year. I mean, this is not a step up. The Pac-12 much as we make fun of it, it was a really good league this year. They played 6 ranked teams. They beat 4 of them, at least teams that were ranked at the time. I know some of those didn't age as well, but that's a pretty strong team. Like I said, Utah's Utah, Oklahoma State, they're the defending champions of the league. I am interested to see what will happen at quarterback. I know Alan Bowman, speaking of guys trying to come back for about a 17th year of college football, is potentially going to try and work his way back in. That would be my one question there. But Ollie Gordon's back, Brennan Presley's back, Colin Oliver's back. It seems like it's been the opposite offseason of last year for Oklahoma State so far. I think you definitely have to respect them as a contender. Plus, again, Mike Gundy, every time you count him out, the guy just comes roaring back. So he's in it. Kansas, I do have some questions because I think Jason Bean is a huge loss just because look, Jalen Daniels played 3 games this past year. He's played about a full season of college football in the last 2 years, just a smidge under probably. So his availability to me is a big question mark there. And Cole Ballard, I don't think has nearly the ceiling. Plus Jeff Grimes, I mean, that's kind of a Rorschach test. What do you see with the ink blot there? Do you see the guy that had 2 back-to-back pretty bad offenses at Baylor and got run out of Waco, or do you see the guy that had Zach Wilson and put together a really good offense at BYU? I think it's a step down from Andy Kotelnicki. But look, Devin Neal's a phenomenal running back. I think he rivals Ollie Gordon as the best back in the conference. I think he's tremendous, and they have clearly great receivers and just a program that's trending in the right direction and a pretty cushy schedule. So I think Kansas is there. I would still put K-State in that group. I think Avery Johnson's a future star at quarterback. If you compare what he did this year, how he looked in the bowl game compared to other freshmen like Jackson Arnold, who was a turnover machine. Avery Johnson, 250 plus yards, total yards in the game, 3 total touchdowns, not afraid to just throw the ball away. He was not getting a lot of help from, they were playing receivers like Seth Porter, who's just a senior program guy, and nothing against him. Love the guy, but he was not going to create much separation or get open. I think they're going to be better at receiver next year. They're chasing some good targets in the portal, and K-State's got Jace Brown emerging as I think the true number 1 guy next year, and he had a great bowl game. So I think you pair him with DJ Giddens too, who is probably the most underrated running back in the conference. There's not enough talk about him. He had more yards from scrimmage this year than Devin Neal, for instance, and he's going to be back. K-State will have 3 guys with starting experience back on the offensive line. Yes, you're losing 2 NFL guys and one of the best in college football in Cooper Beebe, but they've been pretty good at replenishing there, and I think that's where they have about as much program depth as anywhere in the program. Period. The defense, pretty rock solid. Kobe Savage will be tough to replace. I think they've gotten better on the defensive line where they lost like Nate Matlack, who was probably a surprising one to some. They're still pretty good at corner, even though they did lose Will Lee. That's a guy I can tell you they did not attempt to retain. So he went to Texas A&M, but they did not feel like that was someone they wanted to keep around in the program. They've been pretty good at defensive back. They've sent a transfer DB to the NFL 3 straight years. I expect them to continue to be pretty good there. And I would say the schedule's manageable, kind of medium hard as far as Big 12 schedules go next year. Plus, Chris Kleiman won the league 2 years ago. I would put K-State in that group. I'm just working my way down the list here. I already mentioned UCF. Look, Iowa State, I think I respect what they did at the end of the year with Matt Campbell and a young group of talent. Disappointing bowl game, but there's enough talent there and a quarterback, which is the biggest thing. They've got a young quarterback that obviously played really well this year. They seem to have figured things out there. And Matt Campbell, I just think, has a high floor. Maybe not the high ceiling that Iowa State fans would want as a head coach, but I think he's got a pretty high floor. So I think you can throw them in the mix there. West Virginia is one that I struggle with, where I kind of, I'm like, some days I can get in and buy that. I mean, there was a lot to like about this year, but they had pretty much the total opposite schedule of what they had this past year, where it was very, very reasonable for them. They're going to have to go to Arizona. They're going to have to go to Oklahoma State. They've got to go to Texas Tech. They host KU and K-State and Iowa State and UCF. I mean, that's a tough schedule. It's a really tough schedule that West Virginia is going to have. So we'll find out what we need to know about Neil Brown and how much of that was schedule driven this past year. But that to me is kind of the list. And then stopping after that, I mean, you're looking at like Texas Tech, I know has a bunch of talent, and to me, they're still outside looking in. Like, I just got to see it, man. I mean, they haven't won more than 8 games in over a decade. It's just been a long time since we've seen that happen. There's always a bunch of hype every offseason. Tech fans are great, and they're really good at hyping up what they got. But, I was hearing about Zach Kitley was going to be the big difference maker, and then it felt like by the end of the year, they wanted to run him out of town. I'm still not convinced Baron Morton has this ceiling of a Big 12 conference champion quarterback. TCU sitting there as a team that played for the national championship last year. Obviously, it was a huge drop off this past year, but it's hard to ignore the pedigree of what they did 2 years ago and the fact that they can bring in a bunch of talent. So I mean, there are some teams that I think probably have somewhat of an argument there as well. But to me, that list is kind of where I stopped before Texas Tech and TCU.
Yeah, I think those are two legitimate dark horse kind of teams to keep an eye on. I mean, I've said since they hired Joe McGuire, year three is going to be the year for Texas Tech to really know if this is going to work out and if there's going to be a big ceiling. And so I think they continue to recruit really well. You've got another good recruiting class coming in for Texas Tech. Um, I'm a little bit higher on Barry Morton probably than you are, but I think he's in a serviceable enough quarterback to in a wide open 16 team conference to maybe get them to Arlington. Like I agree though. We got to see it to believe it. With Kansas State, it's so hard based off of kind of how the trend has been in the Big 12 of you get there and then you're going to go back to the kind of the bottom of your development cycle. And I don't disagree on Avery Johnson. They're going to bring some key pieces back, but we see this every year. Like Big 12 title game participants really seem like they're at a good point in their development cycle. Either at the peak or like the year before, and they're able to get some things to go their way. I'd point at kind of OSU for that case. With Kansas State, how do you see them keeping that consistency with as much turnover? Because we just don't see teams with high turnover get back there without the name Oklahoma on the jersey.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, if we're talking about it in the context of being a Big 12 champion, that probably changes it because my initial reaction is like, well, I mean, last year they lost higher. They had more in terms of losses last year to me. I mean, they lost a first round pick on the defensive line. They lost a second round pick in the secondary. They lost another draft pick in the secondary. And then they lost Deuce Vaughn, who was just like a, program changing kind of talent on offense. And they still won 8 games and were 6 yards away from beating Texas in overtime of, I think, probably playing for a Big 12 championship. I think the Iowa State game may go differently if there's more on the line there that last game of the year. So I just think this year you're not taking significant losses like that. You're going to upgrade, I think, at the quarterback position. Love Will Howard, and as crazy as it is to say that because he's probably going to be playing for Ohio State next year. I think Avery Johnson just is a guy who can elevate others, and Will Howard's a guy that can take a team where you want it to go when you have a lot of talent around him. I didn't even mention that they lost Malik Knowles, who was much more dynamic as a playmaker at wide receiver than anybody they had this year. I would even argue Cade Warner was. And both of those guys were gone from the Big 12 championship team heading into this past year. I mean, they just frankly were not very good at receiver most of the year, and they still found a way to put together a 9-win season. So Chris Kleiman's just been really consistent. The COVID year is the only year where they've really dropped that. Well, it is the only year where they've dropped below 8 games. And that first year, I mean, 2019, they didn't have a scholarship running back on the roster when he took over, and they found a way to go 8-4 in the regular season and beat Oklahoma. Like he just knows how to program build. Their program depth is much better than where it was when he took over. The recruiting class that they had last year is the best the program's had in a very long time. And you're going to start to see some of those guys who didn't play much as freshmen coming into the fold this year, particularly I would say on the defensive side of the ball. So the talent level is just a lot better in the program, and he's been so rock solid and consistent. I just believe in his pedigree as a coach there, and they're not losing the high end talent that they had last year. And I think you're going to see some of that start to sprout that they have in the program right now. Like I mentioned, like on offense, I mean, the 3-headed monster of Avery Johnson, DJ Giddens, and Jace Brown, I think I think that has the potential to be really, really good for K-State. And I feel better about the offense too, now that they've added Matt Wells, which again, I know Texas Tech fans kind of take a victory lap in laughing at that, but the problems for him at Tech were culture fit, CEO management, and like game management. All things that you do not have to do as a position coach and a co-offensive coordinator. He had really good offenses with Jordan Love. He had really good offenses with Chucky Keaton, but a couple of those didn't wind up looking as good because there were 2 season-ending injuries for him pretty early in the year. So he turned 2 quarterbacks into stars at Utah State, and then at Texas Tech, he had a top 30 offense with a backup quarterback when they ran him out of town at 5-3. Ironically, after a loss to K-State in 2021. So I actually believe in his offensive acumen quite a bit. And I'm excited to see what that's going to look like at K-State. So I think they've done a pretty good job recovering after it looked like, the Colin Klein loss could be something that really punctured a hole in the program. So I still believe in them being a contender. Now, that doesn't mean that they'll win it, but I think they can absolutely be in the mix based on all that.
I think it's a good point. At this point, you kind of got to trust in Kleiman. I think we've seen enough to say, like, we know he's going to have a successful team on the field, whether that's contending for a title or just winning 8, 9 games. Like, they're going to be good. Uh, Iowa State. I'm not ready to put them in the contender list. I have them kind of in my dark horse category. Like they definitely overachieved based off of kind of preseason expectations. Once it came out about the gambling scandal and the players who weren't going to be there, everyone's expectation was this is going to be a bad Iowa State team. How are they going to deal with all this? Whereas I think in Ames, they all kind of knew what was coming long before the news actually dropped. So they'd had way more time to prepare for this than we did as people covering Iowa State. And so the expectation for us was not on par with what the team was preparing for. And so, look, I agree on Rocco Becht. I think that's a guy who looks like he's going to probably be a first team All Big 12 quarterback at some point in his career if he continues to develop based off the level of talent we saw just in his first season. I think they figured out some things on offense that were very anti Matt Campbell. There was a switch flipped from non-conference to conference play, which is also very Matt Campbell. And I'm not going to hold a bowl game against him because Matt Campbell doesn't care about non-conference games. So they could go 0-4 outside of the Big 12 and still win the Big 12. But my problem with Iowa State is it's a little bit like Texas Tech. Like you got to the title game in the COVID year. I need you to prove that you can do that without other circumstances going on or that are affecting everyone else. And so, like, I'm not arguing with as much as they were bringing back. Like, I think they bring back like the entire offense and everybody, but a couple of key pieces on defense. Obviously, like I think TJ Tampa and another player in the secondary. It was a really good secondary. Like, I understand what they're coming back, and I think they'll continue to develop. I need to see something from Iowa State outside of a COVID year that makes me go like, no, this team can put it all together for a whole season, treat the non-conference like it matters to actually have a really good year and say we're going to be in Arlington again.
Well, you're preaching to the choir there. I'm kind of a little deferential to them because of what happened, I think, in that K-State game, which I will not call it fluky. I mean, it was a horrific effort from K-State, but the defense was pretty good all year, and that was historically in the years that they've been tracking advanced stats, the worst performance we've ever seen from a K-State defense. So you can draw your own conclusion, I suppose, from that. I mean, there was some play like Will Lee was a guy, so they didn't try to keep. He's the one who ran down Sama in the snow and then just like shoved him forward, gave him a little speed burst on his way to the end zone for 20 yards. There were a lot of weird things happening in that game, but look, I have to kind of pay respect to what they did. They tore K-State up. With Iowa State, I think the deal with Matt Campbell is like, I think he's got a lower ceiling than what everybody thought when he was first bursting onto the scene, but I think he's got a much higher floor than anybody that's kind of, praying for him to just lay in waste and go away when it looked like they had some struggles. I think he's too good of a coach to let Iowa State wallow around where like Paul Rhodes had it, 3-4 wins every single year. They obviously had the blip on the radar one year with that a couple of years ago with the 4-8, but I don't think that's going to be very consistent. I think he's a guy that, and Iowa State fans will laugh. I've kind of made a joke out of it and certainly did. I used to. He's like, he's going to be a 7-5 sort of guy. I just think that's where they're at every year with him. And I don't think they have that ultimate ceiling. I mean, yeah, the COVID year was wonky, man. I mean, it was like Texas A&M, Iowa State, North Carolina had these amazing years. And we've kind of seen what those programs were outside of that under the same coaches. They have not been able to really replicate all of that. And there was a ton of weird things happening that year. And let's throw into the mix this. I mean, look, Brock Purdy is like in the MVP discussion in the NFL right now. Breece Hall is a legitimately very good NFL running back. Charlie Kolar is a very good tight end. Like they had so much talent. They had the Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year at linebacker on that team. And yet they still didn't beat. I mean, that was not a quintessential Oklahoma team in the Big 12 championship game. And then they went 7-6 the next year with the entire group of guys back. So I don't see Iowa State I don't think this group is going to be more talented than that group. So I agree with you. I don't see them winning it. It was more like out of respect for exceeding the expectations. My respect for Campbell is a guy who does, I think, have a very high floor and a league that's just, it's not going to be a Texas or an Oklahoma, somebody running away from everybody likely in the league. I kind of thought, we'll throw them in the mix, but I think your concerns are all very, very valid with Iowa State.
I'm not here. I have most of these same teams like on the same list. So any poo-pooing for me is me just literally like going back and forth internally and having someone to vocalize it to.
Yeah.
For Oklahoma State, like they got to Arlington in the season, and I don't. Look, I am outside of Big 12 an Oklahoma State fan, but even though Oklahoma State fans are like, we're going to win the Big 12 because we've got all these players coming back, and they've had a ton of players announced. You get three of your starting offensive line. Obviously, Ollie Gordon's coming back. You've got a bunch of defensive studs that are coming back, and I get all of that. But this is an Oklahoma State team who this season led the nation in winning 6 games in which they trailed in the second half. Oklahoma State allowed more points per game, 28.6, than any other team that won 10 games this year and scored fewer points per game, 29.6, than all of them except Iowa. They won 10 games with a 1 point differential. Like, I understand that some of that's wonky because you get the Cincinnati blowout and you get blown out by UCF and lose badly to South Alabama. But still, like, it was an Oklahoma State team that was the most Mike Gundy, like, winning close games. Mike Gundy is the king of close games. His record is basically he's like sapped away all of Matt Campbell. Matt Campbell can't win close games. Mike Gundy can. I look at this team and go, like, I understand they're bringing everything back, and we don't know what they're going to do at quarterback. That's a big question mark. Maybe Alan Bowman gets a 17th season. Maybe it's Garrett Rangel. I don't think they're going to go to the portal for another quarterback this year. That's not the feeling that I'm getting from the program. With all that stuff there, it's like OSU is going to be a contender because of all the pieces that came back. But I'm going to see a major leap on defense with Brian Nardo, defensive coordinator, in his second year, and some other guys develop before I'm like, you got there, and it's great. But man, I'm not going to call it fluky because you won the games. But man, it's so hard to replicate that level of success with that small a margin for a second year.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, Phil Steele always has his list of like teams that he predicts are going to take a big jump or regression. And a lot of it is based on, like, that is one of the big factors, is how close wins from the year before, because it's the type of thing that can really swing pretty drastically from year to year. Now, it doesn't always work like that, because I do remember the 2011 K-State team, the first year that Colin Klein was a starting quarterback. They won, I believe it was 7 games by a touchdown or less. And a lot of people had that feeling. And the expectations from the outside world were not really that high for the team going into 2012, because they thought, well, they're going to kind of fall back. They had a lot of close wins, and it was a little bit fluky. And then they took a jump up to where they were number 1 in the BCS in November and won the conference. So it doesn't always mean that that's what's going to happen. But yes, I do understand what you're saying with that. And I would just feel a lot more comfortable if I knew what was going on at quarterback there. I mean, I think, like, and even with Alan Bowman, Alan Bowman is what he is. I mean, I think he's solid. He can get the ball to some of the playmakers, but he's not going to be overly dynamic as a quarterback. But at least that would give me confidence there's a steadying force there. Rangel, maybe a higher ceiling. I'll be honest, I don't know a whole lot about the guy. But that's the thing at quarterback, because I think there is going to be some really good quarterback play in the league. It'll be tough if you're not going to have a guy that you can rely on at QB. But Gundy to me is like Matt Campbell on steroids. Like, he's going to have a high floor, but he's also shown that he has the ceiling to win the league and win 11 games and go win a New Year's Six Bowl, right? I mean, be somebody that can be within an eyelash of the college football playoff or the national championship game. So I just have to buy in and respect that, because I was hearing it from all the Oklahoma State fans that watch my channel this past offseason. I know it was hard and people were really jumping ship, and all the conversation about NIL with Gundy and is the game passing him by and that sort of stuff. And I was finally kind of buying into that. Like, hey man, I've really respected this guy, but it does feel like it's slipping away. And then he comes back with, one of the best coaching jobs that we've seen from him. So I'm done doubting him. I think you have to just give them the respect and say that they'll be in the mix.
I think that's fair. You mentioned quarterbacks. I'll divert a little bit. Obviously, we're going to have Rocco Becht back. Avery Johnson's going to take over for Kansas State. Cam Rising is going to be back. KJ Jefferson is joining UCF. Baylor added Daquan Finn from Toledo, who's fantastic. Like, it does feel like after kind of a down year from quarterback play in the Big 12, we're about to see frankly a step up, both from changing of the guard, some guys getting a year better, and some other guys joining the conference. It's hard not to say this is going to be the year of the running back with RJ Harvey and Devin Neal and Ollie Gordon. Like, 4 of your top 5 running backs from this past season are returning, and there's going to be other guys who step up. Maybe I'm going to pronounce it's Abu Sama from Iowa State. Maybe he has a big year. If you were going to peg year of insert here, is it quarterback, running back, or something else in the Big 12 in 24?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue with running back. I mean, they're just going to be so strong there. I mean, I think like Taj Brooks is a phenomenal running back. He's coming back at Texas Tech. Like, DJ Giddens, like I said, at over 1,500 yards from scrimmage, over 1,200 yards rushing. He looked phenomenal in the bowl game against NC State, which is a top 20 defense. Yeah, Harvey is great at UCF. Devin Neal, fabulous. Ollie Gordon literally was the best running back in the country this past year. So um, I think you can't I can't just defer away from that, but I do think quarterback play will be better. And I think this was kind of a down year, gap year, maybe if you want to call it, for quarterback play in the league. And I'll refer to, I was reading Heartland College Sports. I think it was Pete Mundo that had a piece the other day where he said, hey, look, like Texas was a deserving champion. They were a deserving team in the college football playoff, but they did perhaps get a little bit fortunate that their biggest weakness this year was the secondary, and the league was maybe not as poised to take advantage of that weakness as they typically would be. And the two best passing attacks they saw this year were Washington and Oklahoma, and those are coincidentally two teams that they lost to when they had to go up against Dylan Gabriel and then Michael Penix. So, and look, I mean, I saw that K-State game, for example. I love Colin Klein, but I felt like they waited way too long to get away from the running game, which was doing nothing. I mean, T'Vondre Sweat was just tearing them a new one, and it took them a long time to make the adjustment. And once they did, they came roaring back and probably still should have won the game. But if they make that adjustment a little bit earlier, things maybe go differently in Austin. So just helping slam home the point that, yeah, I think quarterback play was a little bit down. I think the transfer portal work has been good. I think like Jalen Daniels deserves mention too. If he's going to stay healthy, I mean, he's a guy that we've seen at his top end can be a really, really good quarterback. So if he stays healthy, if KJ Jefferson hits, if the kid at Baylor hits, which I know there's a lot of excitement about him, who they got in the transfer portal, Avery Johnson is who we think he is, et cetera, et cetera. You go on down the line. I think it could be a year with much better quarterback play.
We kind of led this conversation off talking about how wide open the Big 12 is going to be. We've got list of contenders that are 7-8 long with some guys or some teams just outside. And that's been the expectation of the Big 12. But we're also hearing a lot of conversation about how good the Big 12 is going to be moving forward. We get the national pundits about, the Big 12 is going to be a one bid league, which is basically saying if they didn't have an auto bid, the Big 12 might not even get a team in the 12-team playoff a lot of times, which we can set aside the ludicrousness of that all for another day, just so that they can get in some more 8-win SEC teams. From your mindset, and I've gone back and forth on this internally for a little while, do you think this is the best version of the Big 12, where we're having multiple teams contending year in, year out? Or would the Big 12 be better off, given the way college football is now, given the way the sport is covered, and with the 12-team playoff and winning national championships being the only thing that matters as to whether or not your conference is good or not? Would the Big 12 be better off having another Oklahoma, a team that just kind of dominates the conference year in, year out, wins more often than not, and has great postseason? Well, they didn't have great postseason success, so that doesn't really translate. But having one team that just dominates the conference and becomes the brand everybody knows.
I think it's a great question, and I think what you said at the end there kind of stumbled into with Oklahoma is the key. I think there's nuance to this. If it is a team that can have legitimate postseason success and they're running the league every single year, then I think that's probably better. If they can actually win games and get to Final Four, I still have a hard time seeing anybody from the Big 12 being able to win it in this format. Unfortunately, the TCU blueprint against Georgia from 2 years ago is one that's hard to shake from your mind, but I would say that if you have somebody, if it is Utah, if it is Oklahoma State, if it's Arizona, whoever it might be, if they can go and consistently win games in that playoff and be someone that's viewed as a threat there, then that may be best, because you would get a team that at least has some respect in the top 10. Because you go look at, there was a list that just came out of from Bet Online of the college football playoff odds or national championship odds, and it was like out of the top 10, Florida State, I believe, was in there, but everybody else was Big Ten or SEC. I mean, that's the type of world you're going to be living in. If you can have somebody that at least gets into that discussion, I think that would probably be better for the league. But if you're not, if it's going to be somebody that's like an Oklahoma that would dominate the league and then just be out in the first round or two of the playoff every single year, then I think it's better to just be this version of the conference, kind of be who you are. And I think, unfortunately, that's probably the more likely scenario, because you just got to kind of be different, and I think Brett Yormark has sort of understood that. And that's one of the things that makes him great as a leader of this conference. Is like George Kliavkoff, I think, was too much trying to play the same game, being like, hey, we are basically the Big Ten. The Big Ten got this $1 billion TV deal. That's great news for us because we're close to them and we're going to be close to matching that. And that's not what you are. You gotta try and be different. Like, the ship has sailed, the toothpaste is out of the tube. They're making too much money. The resource gap is too big. you've got to find a way to be fun and different. And that's what the Big 12 is, not just with a football league that's not going to be drugged down by, Rutgers, Indiana, Northwestern, Purdue, like the Big Ten is every single year. It's going to be tough, basically, any game that you're playing. Even, like Houston had a really rough year last year. They just hired Willie Fritz, man. He's a great football coach. Like, that's going to be a tough out. So the league is going to have so much depth. It's going to be wild. It's going to be fun. And then you have basketball, where you really emphasize basketball. Like, Yormark has realized, I got to zag where everybody else, where the Big Ten and the SEC are zigging. We just have to do it a different way. So that's kind of it's a nuanced answer, maybe a little bit of a hedge, but I think it would depend on if your team at the top would actually be a perceived threat in the playoff, at least for the first couple of rounds. And that's something that, I mean, I'll be honest, it is kind of a tough read. I feel like it's still more unlikely than likely, but it is sort of a tough read as to how exactly that's going to work out in this 12-team playoff era, which does make it pretty fascinating.
Yeah, like it's okay to be self-aware and to look for ways to make yourself good, even if you're not going to be the same as the rest of them. So, John, really appreciate your time, man. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Do me a favor, where can everybody check out the work you do covering the Big 12 and college sports?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. The YouTube channel is just John Kurtz, JohnKurtz. Live shows Wednesdays and Sunday nights, which are a lot of fun. That's the main draw there, but you'll get some other content there as well. You can find me on Twitter at JLKurtz if you want more of the day-to-day sort of stuff. And if you are a K-State fan, I co-host a K-State specific podcast with a couple of my buddies, Cole Manbeck and Derek Young on KC Sports Network. It is called 3MAW. You always say EMAW, every man a Wildcat, EMAW, but with a 3. 3MAW is the podcast, wherever it is that you find podcasts.
Appreciate it, John.
Hey, take care.